Hi guys, welcome to the Catawba River at night. So for this episode of Campfire Tales, we thought we'd bring you out here for where we usually do our ghost tours and maybe tell you a couple of stories that we normally tell if you were to join us on a normal year where we'd actually be going down the Catawba at night and telling these stories. So our first story of the evening, I'm just going to give you guys a little selection here, but our first story of the evening actually takes place back during the Great Flu epidemic here in Gaston County in 1918. And back then, the river was actually a pretty substantial, a pretty regular business highway. People would float goods up and down the river from the different mills all the way down to South Carolina, down to Columbia. And these river boatmen, now don't think about the big Mississippi river boats where it's the big steam-powered boats. These were more like skiffs and flat-bottom boats that were going down the river at the time, and they would take bales of cotton and textile goods that were already made all the way down. But along the river, there was a couple of houses, and in one of those houses was a young girl named Bess. Actual name was Elizabeth, but they called her Bess. And Bess liked to play on the shore of the Catawba, and she liked to wave to the river boatmen as they would go down the river. Now, when the Great Flu epidemic hit, unfortunately, happened to hit a lot of children the hardest, and Bess was no different. In fact, one day, a lot of the river boatmen would notice that Bess wasn't out there waving at them. One day, one of those gentlemen stopped by her parents' house. Her father came to the door, and he said, "I just happened to notice that Bess wasn't down there at the river playing and waving to us as we went by as normal." And her father said, "Yeah, unfortunately, she's gotten very sick, and we're really worried about her." And the riverboat captain was, "Well, I'll pray for her, and I hope she definitely gets to feeling better." About a week or so went by. The riverboat captain was coming back down the Catawba with his load, and he noticed Bess was out there once again playing on the shoreline. She waved to him, he waved back, tooted his horn at her, and he thought, great, she's all better, all healthy. So the next time he was in Belmont, he swung by to see the family, saw her father out working in the yard, and said, "How's it going? I saw Bess is all feeling better. That's great news." Her father stopped and looked at him and said, "What are you talking about? Bess died 3 days ago." The captain said, No, that's not possible. I just saw her yesterday morning. She was out there playing." Father said, no, said we laid her in the ground at the cemetery. Sure enough, every morning for a few years there, the river boatman would see a little girl playing on the river. She'd wave to them as they went by. As soon as they tooted her horns at her, she would disappear.
Hang on, let me focus. Okay.
So our next story actually has a little bit of a funny spin. And I like to call this story, "If Mama's Not Happy, Ain't Nobody Happy." So there was a lady living here in Gaston County by the name of Millie Hewitt. And Millie had a young son who was a very successful businessman and was quite proud of himself in the fact that he had bought one of the very first automobiles here in Gaston County. And he took great pride in taking all of his friends, business associates out for a ride in his new automobile. In fact, he was so busy taking everyone out, he forgot perhaps the most important person. He didn't take Mama out for a ride. And Miss Millie very much wanted to go for a ride in this new contraption. And she was rather upset with her son that he had not taken her out yet. And he kept telling her, yeah, Mama, I'll take you out soon." Finally, Miss Millie had had enough of this. And she decided that anybody could drive this newfangled contraption. And that if he was too busy to take her out, well, by gum, she would take herself out. So she got her best friend, Miss Edith Lineberger, and they hopped into the automobile one day when her son was not around. And they took themselves on a little joyride. In fact, they took themselves out on the joyride onto the new Highway 74, which had just been built, and the bridge had been built over the Catawba. Well, unfortunately for Miss Millie, once they got out on the bridge, they lost control of the automobile and went right into the Catawba River. Now, they were fine. They didn't die. In fact, some folks that had been crossing the river as well managed to go and fish them out. Unfortunately, they could not fish out that brand new automobile. And Miss Millie was so upset that she had lost her son's automobile that we think after she did pass away a few years later, about 7 years later, people started to see an older lady in a house dress walking up and down the I-74 bridge, looking over into the Catawba. I think it was probably Miss Millie seeing if she could figure out how to get her son's automobile out of the book. So now our story is going to take a slightly creepier turn. So we have two interesting creatures that can be found here in Gaston County, both of them right on the river. One of them is actually not on the Catawba River, it's actually on the South Fork River, and that's the red-eyed devil. So the red-eyed devil is known to haunt the woods all along the sides of the river. And like a lot of paranormal creatures you hear about, he has red eyes, you see him at night, when you're alone in the woods. But the interesting thing about the Gaston County red-eyed devil is his smell. First thing you notice is not those red eyes, it's actually the smell, which smells, from what we're told, like a cheap convenience store cigar. Think Swisher Sweets. But that's actually the first thing you smell, is that cigar. And then you happen to notice the red eyes looking at you. And one of our interesting things is that our red-eyed devil also tends to stick around if you try to approach him. Nobody's ever gotten close enough to actually see what he looks like, because as they start to walk towards him to see, who is this person out here smoking a cigar that's following me, he starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the closer you get to him, the bigger he gets. And he doesn't stop growing. Never heard tell of anyone actually getting right up on top of him. By that point, he starts moving towards you. And most people don't tend to stick around too close. So our next paranormal creature is the Man of Gaston County. And the Man is actually located here on the Catawba. So we actually have a couple of reports, actually several reports of the Man. The earliest dates back to the 1700s. Now, where the South Fork of the Catawba and the main point of the Catawba meet, there's actually a point of land there called South Point. It used to be an old fort there back in the 1700s. Our first knowledge of the Frogman actually comes from that fort, where there was stories from the Catawba Nation, the Native American tribe known as the Catawba, which were plentiful and abundant. This was actually their land. And they were telling the soldiers that were in that fort about this creature that looked humanoid, maybe about 4 or 5 feet tall, that had the head of a big fish or a frog. And it would come walking up out of the depths of the Catawba onto the banks, and it would eat small animals and then go back into the water. The most recent account of this frogman that we've heard was actually in the 1960s. And there was a group of 3 girls, middle school age, walking down the banks of the Catawba with their dog, and the dog rounded a bend and started barking crazy, just going absolutely nuts. And so the girls ran around there to see what it had found. They figured it was a tortoise or a muskrat or something. And sure enough, they saw this large humanoid figure, all wet and slimy looking, with the big head of a bullfrog. And unfortunately, it was eating their dog. Took the dog, ran back down to the river, and sort of waddled, I suppose, and went under the water. And of course, the girls were absolutely terrified. They ran back and told their parents. Their parents, of course, didn't believe them that it was a frogman. They figured maybe there was an alligator or something that had gotten in the water. And so they got the local sheriff, came back down, looked everywhere, found the dog's collar, and found footprints of a large frog-like creature, webbed feet, heading through the sand back into the water. Haven't had any recent reports, but maybe we'll see something tonight. Who knows? Thanks for joining us, guys. We'll see you later.